May their memory be a blessing. We have all said this phrase time and again on the mention of loved ones who have died. It's a familiar and comforting wish at a moment when we are at a loss for original words. Today, as we finish the Yizkor service, I want to talk about memory and blessings, and in particular about one form of blessing that appears in today's liturgy. I want to bless the memory of one man, my great-grandfather Sam, and at the end of a holiday week that marks the flight from barbarity, I want to talk about refugees and the refugee crisis in a part of the world that many of our ancestors themselves fled. When I think about Pesach, above all, I think about my great-grandparents on my mother's side. For the first 14 years of my life, Seder meant driving to my mother's father's parents' house in Forest Hills, Queens. I'd like to tell you that it was there that I learned about slavery and the 10 plagues and our escape from Egypt, about the crossing of the Red Sea, and about God's compassion when that sea swallowed Pharaoh's army. But the truth is that most of the service had been in Hebrew, and I was sitting so far away from my great-grandfather Meyer at the other end of a very long table that I didn't actually catch most of what he said. But it must have made an impression, because when Meyer died, the privilege of leading my family's Seder skipped over 2 generations and passed directly to me. I was 14, and at the helm of the sacred ritual, I found a Haggadah that felt timely and accessible. Passover became my favorite holiday, and it remains so 40-something years later. At those early gatherings in Queens, often 3 of my maternal great-grandparents were present. Missing was my grandmother's father, Sam, who had died when I was 2. I didn't really know him, but I knew his stories. An immigrant from Poland, he ran a bakery with my great-grandmother, Anna, and eventually he became recording secretary of the Bronx Bakers Mutual Aid Society. He was a problem solver who would drive Anna crazy by breaking things in the house just so he could fix them. And he was a frugal man who would drop a dime into a glass of seltzer, drink the whole glass, and then recover the dime he had saved by not ordering a milkshake. The biggest memory I inherited has some written documentation. In 1937, Sam, who at this point was well established in New York, went back to visit his family in the village of Narol, Poland. During that visit, a rumor broke out that a quote-unquote rich American was in town. And some hooligans broke in the house, and in the chaos that followed, one of Sam's relatives, one of my relatives, was killed. In a letter that's now framed and hanging in the entranceway of my house, Sam obliquely writes to his wife and children in phonetic English, "We had an accident in our family and it spoiled my vacation." My family blessed me with those stories, but that's not the blessing I'm talking about. When I was 33, I went to Narol, which is 11 miles from the border with Ukraine. I was alone, driving a Fiat with a stick shift and a throttle, passing horse-drawn carriages and watching the chickens and ducks scattered as I pulled into town. I didn't speak the language, but I found the library and essentially played Pictionary with the librarian to explain who I was. She then used her crank telephone to call a young woman named Joanna, who did speak English rather well. Joanna and I spent 3 hours walking the foggy streets visiting the ruins of a castle, and walking up a hill covered in haystacks where the Jewish cemetery used to be. Joanna talked about the anti-Semitic comments she still heard in the village, a village with no Jews remaining, of the scapegoating our people for the economic hardships of post-communist Poland. And then I left, and I lost connection with Joanna for more than 20 years until Google and email brought us back in contact in 2014. She now lives near Zamość with her husband. It's a small city near Narol, and a UN World Heritage Site with colorful Renaissance-era town square. When Russia invaded Poland this year, Zamość occasionally seeped into the news. The refugees, cold, scared, often stuck at the border for days, sometimes entered Poland near my great-grandfather's village. Zamość, 40 miles from the border, was the first city they came to. The city was housing and feeding refugees at a frantic clip, and remembering their own hardship during World War II, when the Gestapo separated parents from children and shot and killed an estimated 8,000 people in town. In March, an Irish reporter visited Zamość and asked a school teacher why she volunteered at the refugee center. Our heart is open to them. The teacher said, we feel their pain. She remembered and turned that memory into a blessing. Of course, I thought of Joanna. At a friend's urging, I wrote to her and asked if I could raise some money, could you spend it? She wrote back immediately, of course we could. What happened over the next few days felt like a miracle of technology, but also a miracle of kindness. I put out a tiny little bat call to my family, to a few colleagues, to my neighborhood listserv. Within a few days, $4,000 came in, which I transferred via PayPal to Joanna and her husband, Tadeusz. A few days later, I was receiving photos on WhatsApp of shopping carts filled with baby food, grown-up food, and household cleaning supplies. A Zamość City Council member thanked us on Facebook. He said the support was not coming from governments. It was coming from individuals like my neighbors. This is the blessing I'm talking about. Today, during the memorial prayer, we said, in loving testimony to their lives, I pledge tzedakah to help perpetuate ideals important to them. What can be more relevant to use of tzedakah to honor Passover, a holiday of refugees, and the memory of one particular refugee with direct support for the latest wave of refugees coming from a part of the world that so many of us claim for our own heritage. One good act led to another. Through a series of introductions, Joanna and Tadeusz, who might be listening right now, met a family, 3 women, 1 17-year-old boy, 3 generations, in particular need of assistance. Where the money we raised, mostly in Durham, they bought the family food, clothing, and medication. They paid for tuition too, so the young man could graduate high school in Poland. This week I sent out more emails and even more money came in, another opportunity for direct neighbor-to-neighbor support. When Rabbi Graber first roped me into doing this sermon, he said something that stuck with me. To remember is to take action to bring about redemption. The Torah uses the phrase God remembered, and it's often tied to an action. God remembered Noah and every living thing, and then made the floodwaters recede. God remembered Sarah, and Sarah conceived. God remembered the covenant with our people, and led us out of bondage in Egypt. And here we are today celebrating Pesach. None of us can fully redeem the suffering of our refugee ancestors, but we can remember and we can do good works that lessen the suffering of others. And memory can become a blessing, the blessing of baby food, the blessing of medicine, the blessing of a spring jacket for a young man getting ready to graduate high school.